While Ukraine is currently under military attack by Russia, Belarus is softly occupied without the Kremlin having to fire a single shot, even if Putin failed to overtake Ukraine. It can be argued that Belarus, headed by Alexander Lukashenko, quickly turned into an extension of Russian territory. On the other hand, Russia is developing very close political, economic, and military ties with Belarus. Russia's main interests in Belarus are twofold. First, Belarus is economically important to Russia as it acts as a gateway for more than 20% of Russia's energy exports to the EU. Second, Belarus is very important to Russia's security. Belarus is the shortest route to Russia's Kaliningrad region via the so-called Smak Corridor, a 65-mile stretch of land on the Polish-Lithuanian border that provides Russia's access to the Baltic Sea, but is not under Russian control. Belarus also has a long border with Ukraine and has served as a launching pad for Russia's expansionist policy in the region. With these interests in mind, Russia has always been willing to retain control over Belarus. It did this by creating a model of sponsored authoritarianism and increasing Belarus's dependence on Russia. Lukashenko's economic dependence on the Kremlin has increased significantly since 2020. The Kremlin has steadfastly supported Lukashenko, who has ruled Belarus with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades, helping him fend off months of mass protests sparked by his re-election in August 2020, which the opposition in the West accused of fraud. Also, just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Lukashenko allowed the Russian army forces to conduct weeks-long military exercises on Belarusian territory. The exercises, called Allied Resolve 2022, allowed Russia to transfer military equipment and troops to Belarusian territory near the Ukrainian border. Russia maintains about 10,000 soldiers in Belarus at last, as a result of the last constitutional referendum held on February 27, 2022. Belarus rescinded its nuclear-free and official neutrality stance. Both changes are advantageous in the Kremlin's attempt to exert greater control over Belarus and serve to demonstrate Lukashenko's loyalty to Putin. From the beginning of the video, we tried to give you a brief summary of the relations between Russia and Belarus. When we look at the relationship between the two countries, can we say that Russia is preparing to invade Belarus? In fact, the documents prepared by Vladimir Putin can clearly give us the answer to the question. Vladimir Putin's executive office has drawn up plans for the annexation of neighboring Belarus. The document was prepared by the Presidency for Cross-Border Cooperation, a subdivision of the Putin administration whose task is to exercise control over neighboring countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. However, these documents were leaked to various media outlets by unknown persons. Leaked documents show Russia's plans to take full control of its closest ally by 2030. These plans for Belarus revealed the details of a creeping annexation by political, military, and economic. The document published in 2021 outlines plans to establish a so-called union state of Russia and Belarus that will seek to give Russian interests legal priority. Belarusian opposition leaders Fedla, who lives in exile in Lithuania, said regarding the documents that the union state is a threat to the Belarusian people and the Belarusian. This is not a union of equals. It is a roadmap for the absorption of Belarus by Russia. Since our aim is to return Belarus to the path of democracy, it will be impossible to do this in a union state with Russia. The news that Russia's annexation plans were leaked came when Belarus's authoritarian president said the other day that the former Soviet nation would create a new regional defense amid conflicts in neighboring Ukraine. Speaking at a meeting with officials the other day, Lukashenko said that the country should create paramilitary units in every town or village that will act as a regional defense to complete its 45,000-man army in case of attack. In addition, Lukashenko added that every Belarusian man should learn to use weapons if necessary to protect his family. Belarusian Defense Minister Viktor Kren also stated that Belarus will create a force of up to 150,000 volunteers who will carry on civilian affairs when necessary and who will be armed and fight when necessary. This volunteer team will form a military reserve in peacetime and can act as a guerrilla in case of war. In summary, Belarus cannot be equated with a Lukashenko regime, and ordinary Belarusians should be treated equally with Ukrainians in their fight against Russian military aggression in Ukraine. It is very important for the West to adjust its approach to be. The West should support the anti-war initiatives of the Democratic Belarusian movement and punish the Lukashenko regime for its vital role in Russia's aggression in the region. The future of democratic Belarus may depend on it. Russia's annexation of Belarus, or the realization of this claim, seems to be a situation that will occur in the long run. Meanwhile, in Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine, Russia and President Vladimir Putin seems to have failed in all phases of the war and in the international arena. Russia's failure stems from Putin's lack of cohesion and leadership in achieving his lofty goals on the battlefield. Putin's regime has dominated Russia for 20. In fact, many Russian far-right groups worshipped Putin, but Putin threw them into hell. Russia's capabilities have been exaggerated from the start. Both the size of its army and its presumed modernization indicated to many observers that Russia would easily win. But since the invasion began, the Russian army has failed to adapt its strategy and operational objectives to the conditions of. We see that the war in Ukraine has passed through 5 phases so far. At each stage, Ukrainian forces significantly outperformed Russia's due to Ukraine's culture of military adaptability. The lack of such a culture, coupled with a lack of leadership and initiative, continued to hamper the Russian forces. The first phase of the war, which started with the invasion of Russia, lasted for nearly 8 weeks. On April 2nd, Putin changed his approach by shifting his forces east and appointing new general. But Putin hasn't done enough to undo the damage done to his military. After up to 40% of the combat units on the Russian front line were removed, and the supply lines and effective commands were slaughtered, the Russian president shifted troops east. The second phase began on April 18th when Putin launched a new Russian offensive in the east. Russian troops and generals on the ground continued to underperform. There was no meaningful adaptation in the Russian commanders made no attempt to draw hard lessons from previous setbacks. Assembled demoralized units were thrown into the front lines with little planning, poor reconnaissance, and ineffective battlefield leadership. The third phase lasted from July to September. At this stage, the Ukrainian army forced a massive withdrawal of Russian forces in the northwestern Sumy and Kharkiv. Ukraine has been assisted by special teams using covert and disciplined operational security to keep Russia behind its borders. The fourth phase began in late September when Putin announced the annexation of 4 regions of Ukraine and ordered the mobilization of 300,000 more troops. This mobilization move by Russia was rushed and improv. The Ukrainian war is in its 5th phase since September. Although the front line has not moved much, important clashes still take place. Striking clashes on the front lines cause great losses. Russia made minor gains on the central and southern fronts in cities such as Bakhmut and Olyr, but conflicts in this region have turned into a stalemate. Ukraine has balanced limited but sustained counterattacks with an active defense. In addition, Ukraine has allocated its air defense capabilities to protect civilians. At every stage of the war, Ukraine always learned new tactics and grew. However, the same cannot be said for Russia. While equipment, doctrine, training, and leadership are important attributes of any army, the essence of a fighting force comes from what the nation stands for. Vladimir Putin's autocratic kleptocracy has been so far no match for Ukraine's agile democracy. Next, intel just dropped. One of the most critical centers of this attack network is undoubtedly W City next to BMU. It took the Ukrainian forces over a week to complete the seize the hold of the city with the loss of 31 battle tanks in the city of W. The Russians lost control of the city completely to the Ukrainian. In the past days after the Russians had lost their battleships, they began to retreat towards the city's borderlines where he launched a counter-attack against the Ukrainian. With this remaining troops, Russian fighters on the borderlines of Edarbak actually fired dozen shots to protect their calm. It turned out that the invaders who fled from the battlefield by running towards the Russian fighters on the hills, we were members of the 155th Marine Brigade. The soldiers of this Russian brigade were unaware of what they were doing in the landmines as they ran to their comrades who did not leave the hill in front of them. Some of the invading Russian soldiers who were trying to leave their weapons and run away settled in the air due to the mines, and the troops of the Russian artillery brigade speaking to this Russian military group in the opposite region had to helplessly monitor the situation. While this minefield area of Vlada turned into hell for the Russians, Ukrainian forces continued to push all the innate in this area towards the borderlines. The Russian soldiers who managed to escape from this most striking attack of the war, which caused the 155th Russian Marian Brigade to have more than 1,000 soldiers, could not even understand how they got behind the hill in the region. On the other hand, the Ukrainian artillery brigades on the borderline of the city neutralized the successful firing of the TOS-1 thermobaric systems of the Russian troops. Since the TOS-1 thermobaric systems had a range of 4 kilometers, the Russian artillery could not respond to the storm operation of the Ukrainian forces in Mu. After these attacks, the Ukrainians sent the largest assault brigade in the army after the Russian soldiers fleeing. In a desperate situation when the war equipment of the Russian soldiers on the heels of the city was destroyed by the Ukrainian artillery brigade, they too began to flee the country of Voda by switching to the armament that escaped from the minefield terrain. In other words, the Russian troops who left the Hungary, Russian military and hunter that could escape from the minefield terrain with the striking attacks of the Ukrainian forces had to leave the city in Masse. As a result of these attacks, Russia was forced to raid abundant buildings in search of deserted troops. In this regard, a similar statement came from Ukraine. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in its latest report on the state of the war, stated that the Russian forces were searching abundant buildings for soldiers who had left there. The Ukrainian armed forces noted that due to the high rates of desertion from the ranks of the Russian occupation forces, large raids were carried out on the eastern front line, adding that special attention was paid to abundant houses and buildings. On the other hand, the statements of a Russian soldier who committed critical details about the attacks in WLAR fell on the agenda like a bomb. In his statements, the Russian soldiers claimed that 202 Russian soldiers escaped with their weapons from a position near WLAR in the Esk region. As we all know, the low morale, the Russian forces results in high desertion rates. It's possible to say that the high level of Russian losses in Edar was due to a number of factors, including the lack of trained personnel, coordination, and resources at the front. Alexei Dyerkisky, head of the Combined Press Center of the Tarasi district of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, said in a statement that almost the entire brigade of 5,000 people was destroyed near Wa, and the troops were killed, wounded, or captured. Ukrainian official Dyerkisky had that Russia lost 150 to 300 sailors a day near WLAR, and we realized that Russia's troop losses have reached gigantic proportions. On the other hand, a Russian sailor who survived recent clashes in WLAR stated that the survivors were treated like deserters. The Marian Corps of the 155th Marian Brigade of the Pacific Fleet summed up the ill treatment in one sentence, saying that it would have been if I had been captured and never returned. The sailor added that so many were killed in his unit and ones were being raised all the time. The fact that the Moscow army lost a lot of soldiers on the front lines does not pose an extra difficulty for Vladimir Putin, because he's trying to camouflage the lack of soldiers in Putin's army by engaging paramilitary groups, especially in cities on the eastern front lines such as Wledar, Bakhmut, and Sadar be frequently encounter Wagner Group soldier, as it is known. The Wagner Group is a Russian paramilitary organization that is considered to be the so-called private army of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The group is reportedly recruiting comics to fight for Russia on the front lines. Russia is accused of being used to hide atrocities committed to hello Russia's deniability in the Ukraine war. Some of the soldiers belonging to the Wagner Group still take part in the Ukrainian war. Our data show that 43,000 inmates were recruited by the end of December. So far, there's probably over 10,000 orders number are currently fighting at the front, cause the rest were killed, wounded, fled, deserted, or surrendered, while Russian leader Vladimir Putin was trying to hold on to the front lines. Despite the casualties, Ukraine made statements that would fall like a bomb on the agenda. Ukraine has announced when its counterattack against Russia will begin in the year-long war. Anton Garko, advisor to Ukraine's interior minister, outlined the possible timeline shortly after Ukrainian and Western officials discussed the planned spring counterattack by Kiev. Shenko stated that he expects Western equipment to be procured to launch the Ukrainian counter-offensive. Both the United States and Germany have announced that they will send a series of M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 main battle tanks to Ukraine. Britain also announced that it would send 14 of its Challenger 2 main battle tanks to Kiev. Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands have agreed to send up to 178 OB solid Leopard 1A5 tanks to Ukraine, largely manufactured during the Cold War. In total, Kiev expects its allies to supply up to 320 Western, but some sources claim that by the beginning of April, only 50 tanks will reach the front lines. In Ukraine, tanks aside, last month France and Germany committed to sending a large number of new armored infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. In addition, Garchenko reiterated that his country needs hundreds of thousands of warplanes to help in its tough fight against Russia. Shenko noted that drones cost much less than tanks, allowing Ukraine to destroy Russian forces at long range without coming into direct combat contact. In another development, Vako, the UK ambassador to Kiev, said in a statement that NATO countries are training Ukrainian troops abroad for a spring counterattack planned by Kiev and teaching them the skills to use them against Russian troops. In summary, Western states must act quickly for Ukraine to launch an attack against the Russian invading forces. When the weather warms up, the Ukrainian war will evolve into another dimension. With the arrival of spring, Russia is trying to make up for the heavy losses it took in the winter period. Russia already has an active factory producing bullet. Undoubtedly, the most important key figure that Russian leader trusts is Iran. Iranian-made Kaha drones have devastated Ukrainian cities for a year. It is highly likely that Russia will use this tactic in the future. Considering all these risks, the West should really act fast, and promised military equipment should be sent to Ukraine. Once Ukraine has the Western equipment it desires, it can easily carry out an attack against Russia.